It's a real honor to welcome all of you here this evening to this lecture. Your Excellencies, Stuart Beck, Mr. Verma, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, welcome to Carleton and to Canada India Center for Excellence. I want to just share a few words about the rationale behind this lecture and why it has been established. A few weeks ago, I was outside with my 8-year-old grandson, and as he's kicking maple leaves on the grassy boulevard outside our home, he says to me, "Grandpa, what is your favorite season?" I said, "Autumn." "Why?" "Harvest, pumpkins, and pies," I said. Then he looked at me. He says, "But what else?" Then I said, "Autumn is special. It is the only season which takes me back to my childhood in Punjab. Memories come flooding back of crunching sound of talli, shisham, leaves under our feet as I walked with my grandfather from our house to our farm. My grandfather, I remember, would often say, "Listen, watch, feel the air. There is abundance everywhere. The fields are pregnant. Meditate." There is something magical and mystical about this time of the year. The air here in Ottawa, as you have felt it, is crisp and fresh. The colors are a visual delight: earthy, rustic orange, brown, yellow, deep, rich, warm, and glorious. Leaves twirling downward and effortlessly landing on the ground. They remind me of my mother, who is turning 89 this year. Her name is Kashmir Kaur. My mother always exemplified calmness. She was steady, hardworking, but never striving to achieve great things, yet always gentle, giving, doing, and being. For me, I liken falling leaves to good ideas. They come to you effortlessly, gracefully. Just be ready to let them fall into your lap. In my in-laws' mother tongue, which is German, there's a word called, 2 words, einfallen. It's the word that captures this sense of ideas being like falling leaves. Now I want to share about a couple of ideas here. My maternal grandfather, Bishan Singh, he had ideas of adventure and exploration. He came to the United States in the early 1920s. A few years later, he returned to India with a more passionate and compelling idea: freeing India from British rule. His younger brother died due to injuries inflicted by British brutality at Jato da Morcha, which took place from July 1923 to August 1925. It was a non-violent and peaceful agitation. Thus, my maternal grandfather married his brother's widow, and my mother is the offspring of that union. My father, Budh Singh, he is turning 90 this year. He was active in the freedom movement as well as in the post-independence struggle for greater state autonomy within the Republic of India, and more specifically for Punjabi Suba. During the 1960s and 1970s in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, my father would engage my sisters and I in discussion and debate over dinners. Ideas were big on my father's agenda. He encouraged reading. And in grade 7, I read that very famous book by Barbara Ward titled 5 Ideas That Changed the World. But my father would often say, ideas must be transformed into action. Without action, no change happens. During those years, he would often lament the fact that India is not free. Its democracy is far from what it should be. 50% of its population is illiterate. Women have very few rights and privileges and little power. Nearly a quarter of its people live in a form of caste slavery. India and its democracy cannot prosper until every child receives quality education and they become informed citizens who can fully participate in the democratic process. my father would then say, like in Canada, in India, there must be equality of access to opportunities through merit. And two professions, he said, India must develop for economic growth and political stability. That's teaching and nursing. So in 1981, my father's ideas gave birth to Guru Nanak Mission Medical and Educational Trust. My father, my mother, our extended family and friends have worked tirelessly to establish this signature not-for-profit enterprise in Punjab, delivering education, healthcare, and more specifically, nursing education. It was a pioneering Canada-India collaboration to which thousands of Canadians have contributed immensely. Among these thousands, there's three that I'd like to name today. Dr. Sally Thorne, former director of the University of British Columbia School of Nursing. Ms. Linda LeBrant, one of the former CEDA project managers, and Mr. Sarup Man, who is sitting here in the audience. This enterprise has graduated nearly 2,000 nurses, and out of which at least 200 live and work in Canada. The Dhahan Lecture is intended to honor my parents and their effort, and in a small measure, to continue their work. Like all universities, Carleton is a remarkable place for learning and gaining skills, not only for meaningful employment opportunities, but for the exploration of ideas and generation and dissemination of knowledge. A few years ago, there was another small idea of creating a national center focused on Canada-India relations. Thus, the Canada-India Center of Excellence came into being, partly to recognize and celebrate the presence of Indians in Canada for 115 years, and more importantly, to generate new ideas, build creative bilateral coalitions in scientific research and application of technologies, and to engage Canada and India in informed dialogue on strategic public policy issues facing our two great nations. I am grateful to Dr. Rante for her amazing leadership and tireless effort, to Carleton faculty and staff for their contributions, to the Indian High Commission, and to donors and board members in establishing this center and doing important work to build better and more prosperous relationships between Canada and India. Therefore, it is fitting that our speaker today is an individual of immense talent, bountiful ideas, wealth of experience and knowledge, a brilliant scholar, an economist, and someone who has an outstanding record of transforming ideas into public policies which have helped to unleash the creative potential of India and its people, creating confidence, innovation, and greater prosperity for all. It is my pleasure now to welcome India's High Commissioner to Canada, His Excellency Shri Nirmal Verma-ji, to come and introduce our guest speaker. Few words. Admiral retired Nirmal Verma was commissioned into the Indian Navy in 1970. The Admiral assumed charge as the 20th Chief of the Naval Staff on August 31st, 2009, and retired from service on completion of a distinguished career spanning over 4 decades. In his assignments as a senior flag officer, the Admiral has steered development of maritime capability, formulation of induction policy, guided the HRD program of the Indian Navy, and structured the framework of transformation of the Navy's combat capability and infrastructure development. Your Excellency, welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege now to introduce the speaker, Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia, currently the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India. Shri Ahluwalia received his bachelor's degree from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. Later, he received his post-graduation and MPhil degree in economics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. After completion of studies, he joined the World Bank in 1968 as a young professional, and then held various positions, including Chief of the Income Distribution Division. He joined the Government of India in 1979 as economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, after which he held a series of positions, including Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, Finance Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, member of the Planning Commission, and member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He has been a key figure in India's economic reforms from 1980 onwards. In 2001, he was appointed as the first director of the newly created Independent Evaluation Office of the International Monetary Fund. He resigned the position in 2004 to take up the position of Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, which he holds at present. For his outstanding contribution to economic and public service, Mr. Ahluwalia was conferred the prestigious Padma Vibhushan by the President of India. Shri Ahluwalia has written on various aspects of developmental economics, including Indian economic policy, and his articles have been published in a number of prominent Indian and international journals and books. He co-authored Redistribution with Growth, an approach to policy, published in 1975. He also wrote Reforming the Global Financial Architecture, which was published in 2004 as economic paper number 41 by the Commonwealth Secretariat, London. Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, sir.
Ms. Dhahan, High Commissioner of India to Canada, Admiral Verma, Vice Chancellor Dr. Rosianne Runt, and High Commissioner of Canada to India, Mr. Stuart Beck, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all say that it's a great honor to be invited here. I was struck by the background of the Dhahan family, in honor of whose accomplishments you've endowed this lecture, which has given me the opportunity to come here and speak to this audience. I think the values that you identified, which are enshrined in that, are really universal, and I compliment you, your family, and pay tribute to everything that they've done. It's a wonderful record of achievement. So it's a special honor to speak on this occasion. Now, the subject that I've been given is huge, challenges facing India. I think normally it would require, we've just finished preparing the 12th five-year plan, which is about 1,000 pages, and it deals with the challenges. Now, before people start fidgeting and starting to leave, because nobody wants that comprehensive an account, I'm just going to deal with some parts of the problem as we perceive them. And depending on what you're most interested in, maybe if there's time at the end and an opportunity to answer questions, I can fill in gaps. So what I want to do is to deal, first of all, with some short-term challenges, immediate concerns affecting the Indian economy, and which should define our agenda for the next year or so, and then also look at some of the longer-term challenges. Now, I think the short-term challenge, and anyone who reads the Indian papers or surfs the net, I mean, the big issue in India on the economic side right now is the slowing down that has occurred in the economy. You know, I should emphasize that I've interpreted the term challenges to mean economic challenges. I mean, there are a zillion challenges of the Indian economy which are independent, or the whole business of how to get good economic performance. I'm focusing on economic issues. And I think it's probably fair to say that until very recently, the public presentation of India's performance was somewhere between very positive and euphoric. I mean, growth rates of 9%, and we love it, and we soaked it up too. Although a few of us did say that this is not necessarily proof that all problems have been resolved forever. But I think it's true that until about 2008, there was a 5-year period when the Indian economy really performed extremely well. And if you just do an arithmetical average of the growth rate of the Indian economy up to 2008, it comes to something over 8% and below 9%, something like just below 9% for that 4 or 5 year period. Now that obviously is by any standards an extremely good performance. And prior to that, in 2001, there was a study which was, I think, done by Goldman Sachs or somebody, Jim O'Neill, I think, in Goldman Sachs, who invented the concept of the BRICS, and sort of said, well, these countries are going to move very rapidly. And at that time, the projections for India's growth was more like 6% or something like that. It wasn't really so high. So having been projected as achieving reasonably high growth, and then actually having achieved much higher growth, there was a perception that this is really a breakthrough. Now, in 2008, you had the first global financial crisis, and actually India did quite well in managing that. I mean, our growth rate went down in the year 2008, 2009, or 2009, 2010. It went down to something like 6.7%. That's still high, but in that particular year when everybody else was talking about the start of the Great Depression and so on, it looked pretty good. And then in 2010, 2011, it went back to 8.6, and 11, 12, it shot up again. So we had a pretty quick recovery from the first crisis. But I think after 2011, when you had the European crisis, the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, and the whole world seemed to suddenly lurch again, India's growth rate slowed down. Last year, which is 2012, 2013, our growth rate was down to 5%, and the year before that it had been 6.3%. And in the current year, of course, the year is not over, but different people have projected different numbers. The government has projected something a little above 5. Many people think it'll be a little below 5. So if you look at it, you see a transition from somewhere just below 8% to a reasonably good recovery from the first crisis. And actually, if you take it up to the period, say up to 2010-11, you still have an average growth rate which is around 8.5%. But in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a real slowdown. And as I said, in the current year, 2013-14, the expectation varies between a little above 5 to actually a little below 5. So from the government's point of view and from the Indian economy's point of view, the most immediate challenge is to stop this distinct slowdown that has occurred and get the economy back to what would be called a much more reasonable growth rate. Now, what that is, I will come to, but I think the key issue really is why has the slowdown occurred? And our own reading of the situation is that obviously the global the behavior of the global economy in the last 2 or 3 years is an important factor. I mean, growth has slowed down everywhere. It's negative in Europe. It's pretty low elsewhere. Emerging market countries have slowed down. Even China, which traditionally has been the fastest growing emerging market country, this year is likely to grow at 7.5. So there is no doubt that it's a global environment in which India's growth was bound to be affected. But I think our own assessment is that the deceleration that has occurred to 5% is not simply attributable to what has happened globally. I think we're also perceiving, or we are seeing the impact of domestic constraints, which we've begun to hit, because after a fairly long period of very high growth, it's not surprising that not every part of the system that has to adjust to accommodate high growth actually does so. So the challenge really is, can we identify those factors that have accounted for a disproportionate slowdown in growth, and can we correct them? Let me just mention what they are. I won't go into them in great detail. One is, and this is what the financial world tends to focus on almost, I think almost obsessively, is the fiscal deficit. I mean, all countries expanded their fiscal deficit after 2008, and the fiscal deficit is a problem everywhere. In India, too, we expanded the fiscal deficit after 2008. Actually, we got very good results because in the first 2 or 3 years after 2008, we had a very sharp, a quick recovery from 6.7% to 8.3%, and then actually to 9.3%, which I think was in the period 2010-2011. And after that, it slowed down. So the first part of the recovery was good. But the fiscal deficit has remained persistently high, and it has been combined, this expansion of the fiscal deficit has occurred along with a big increase in the current account deficit. That also has been a focus of attention on the part of many analysts. Now, we expected that the current account deficit would increase with faster growth, especially faster growth in an environment where global trade was not expanding rapidly. But it was our assumption that we could manage a somewhat higher current account deficit than traditional by simply being able to attract more foreign investment into the country. I mean, to put some numbers on this, traditionally we've tended to think that a deficit of around 2.5%, current account deficit of around 2.5% is reasonable. Well, actually, in the previous year, that is 2012, 2013, the current account deficit shot up to 4.8%. And before that, it was 3-point-something%. So we were seeing a widening of the current account deficit. As the economy slowed down, exports didn't do well. We're trying to maintain growth, current account deficit widened. So these are clear warning signals that need to be addressed. And of course, in that environment, the interesting thing is that it wasn't very difficult to finance this large current account deficit simply because there was a lot of excess liquidity in the world. I mean, because of easy money policy deliberately followed by the Fed, it wasn't difficult to finance this deficit all of last year. This year, first of all, people began to look at the current account deficits and say, look, this seems to be a little bit of a problem. And of course, earlier in the year, suddenly there were comments made by the Fed chairman that they might in fact have to reverse the easing on the monetary side. And those statements, as we know, globally led to a great sort of reversal of capital flow. And clearly, India got affected more than other countries because India's current account deficit was much higher than other countries. So when this reversal of the external circumstances occurred, India got affected much more. All countries, almost all developing countries, experienced a depreciation in the exchange rate. India experienced much more than other countries. Now, some of this actually was not unreasonable because the fact is that in the previous several years, the exchange rate in real terms had appreciated quite a bit. In India, inflation has always been about 3 or 4% above global inflation, and so you would expect that with that, the rupee would make some adjustments over time. Because money was freely available and the current account deficit was easily financed, this didn't happen, and so the rupee, you could say, was getting to levels which were somewhat uncompetitive. So really, early in the current year, when the global financial environment changed, India was in a position where it appeared more vulnerable, and as a result, we did have a very sharp depreciation in the rupee. Now, as a matter of fact, we've taken a number of corrective steps responding to this situation. I mean, we clearly identified the fiscal deficit as a problem, and the finance minister put out a deficit target, which he has repeatedly said he's going to regard as a red line that he will not cross. So there is a governmental commitment not to allow the fiscal deficit target to be exceeded. There were problems earlier because of excessive imports of gold. A lot of our current account deficit was really due to very high imports of gold, which included quite a lot of speculative aspect to it. That has been brought under reasonable control. And today, about 2 months ago, what the finance ministry said was that compared to a current account deficit of 4.8% last year, we were going to bring it down to 3.7% this year. This actually did lead to some stabilization of expectations. And the rupee, which had depreciated quite a bit, has since then recovered. I mean, it hasn't gone back to its earlier level, but that wasn't desirable anyway. It's now sort of somewhere around 61 rupees to the dollar, having at one stage gone all the way up to 68 plus. So there's a big improvement in the rupee. It's now at a range where I think all the loss of competitiveness, which I mentioned earlier, has actually been reversed, overcome. So we're in an environment where on that front, we should look reasonably good. Better than that is the fact that the underlying performance on the current account side is actually better than what we targeted. I mean, the latest numbers that have come out, they're not actually numbers in terms of current account deficit projection, but monthly numbers on imports and exports. And it's very reasonable to think that the current account deficit this year may well be 3% or even a little lower. I mean, some estimates take it much lower than that. I'm not necessarily relying on an optimistic assumption of that kind. But the bottom line in the short run is we identified the fiscal deficit as a problem. We said we are going to take care of that, and the finance minister is very firmly committed to it. We know that the current account deficit had gone into an uncomfortable level. We have started that correction, and based on what we know as of now, if these trends continue, the chances are that we'll end the year with the current account deficit very close to what would be a comfort level. So big improvements in the short run on that score. But I think the third very critical area, which I think is necessary, I mean, these things help to restore confidence. They help to create an environment in which financial flows will not destabilize the economy. But I think we also need to look at domestic constraints on the supply side, which have actually held back investment in India. And these constraints really take the form of regulatory problems which many large investment projects, especially in the infrastructure sector, have been experiencing. You know, getting clearances from the forest point of view, from land acquisition point of view, etc., has become more difficult. Now, there are many reasons why this is so. I mean, I think what has happened is that a 5-6 year burst of rapid growth led to a lot of investment in projects, quite possibly flouting of some of the rules and regulations in order to get things moving faster. That has led to a considerable pushback on the part of civil society, which is actually, I mean, quite legitimately concerned that while investment should take place, it shouldn't actually be at the expense of flouting environmental norms. So I think the government is zeroing in on this issue, has zeroed in on this issue, and set up mechanisms that would enable quicker decision making to take place so that the necessary permissions can be given, while at the same time ensuring that what needs to be done to protect the environment is credibly achieved and that the relevant actions are appropriately monitored. I think this has been a very big factor in slowing down investments in India. And all the evidence we have suggests that there are a very large number of large projects had got held up because of these clearances. And in fact, when we presented the 12th plan to the cabinet, one of the things that we had said was that leaving these clearances to be done by the relevant ministries was not perhaps a very good idea, because you needed to have a holistic look at what needed to be done. And for that, you needed a special cabinet committee so that when you have differences of views between different ministries, they can be resolved at a political level with a clear identification of what the issues are and political accountability for whatever decision is taken. I think that mechanism has been set up. It's started to operate. I wouldn't say that the impact expected on investment is as yet that visible. But you know, what happens in this is that when something is stalled, you clear up giving certain approvals. It takes some time before the system actually gets back into operation. So I think we are in that situation right now, where the government has started to take action. The government has given a lot of clearances. but we've yet to see a sufficient buildup of investment. Many people tell me that that is beginning to happen, but it's something that we will know more about in a couple of months. All told, my expectation is that we will see in the current year a turnaround in economic performance, which will essentially reassure people that India is not stuck on a 5% growth path. I mean, in a lot of the domestic discussions on the Indian economy, the issue that people focus on is, could it be that India's experience of high growth was simply a temporary experience, and that we're back to 5% growth? And I think the end of this financial year, i.e. the end of March, will demonstrate whether that is true or not. I don't expect that we will end this year with a very high growth rate, but I think we should see quarter by quarter a turnaround. So the real question is that if there is a sufficient turnaround in the current year, is it likely that the Indian economy next year, which means 2014-15, could hope for a growth rate of 6% plus? Now, given the current situation in the world, if India does get put into a growth rate of 6% plus for the next year, then I think many of the somewhat pessimistic assumptions about the future prospects of the economy will get revised, and people will get a sense that we are now moving back to resuming a high growth trajectory. So this is the short-term challenge. Essentially, how to create an economic environment in which people are persuaded that the slowdown that has been witnessed in the last year and continued in the first half of the current year has actually come to an end and been reversed. I think we have identified the critical areas there, and my judgment is that we have a very good chance that at the end of the year we'll see that. Now that takes me to the longer term challenge. I mean, that's just turning around from a pessimistic view of the so-called new normal. The real question is, what are India's medium-term growth prospects? Now, you know, when we prepared the 12th five-year plan last year, we were aware already that the impact of the global crisis on the global economy meant that global growth was likely to be slower than was earlier assumed to be the case. Events since then have only underscored the fact that that slowing down is probably more likely to last longer than was earlier thought to be the case. Some of you may have seen when the recent meetings of the World Bank and the IMF took place, there was a lot of newspaper coverage that the IMF for the last 6 issues of the World Economic Outlook every year has downgraded global growth prospects by a small amount. So actually the world has been underestimating the slowdown that's taken place. So we have to recognize that when we look at India's future prospects, we have to recognize that the world growth will not be as supportive as it was in the past. But what is India's long-term growth? Well, a lot of this depends on which periods you take into account. One technical way of handling this problem is to statistically clean up the series by using well-known statistical techniques. You know, the HP filter is the most commonly used. And to see underlying it, if you separate out the periods of high global growth from the others, what's the underlying growth rate of the Indian economy? And when we've done that, the conclusion is that probably in the last 8 or 9 years, the underlying growth rate of the Indian economy has been something between 7.2 and 7.4%. So the earlier 9% was because the world was booming. If you take all that out, nevertheless, the Indian economy has demonstrated, if you like, a cleaned out capability of growing between 7.2 and 7.4. So therefore, what our view is that we are seeing a steady increase in the growth rate of the Indian economy, which is actually the consequence of a number of economic reform measures which lead to an expansion, an acceleration in the growth of productivity. I mean, everywhere in the world, when countries have grown rapidly, it has been a combination of higher investment and higher growth of productivity. And you need both. In fact, one, to some extent, feeds into the other. Well, on the investment side, I think we're not doing badly. At one stage, we had reached an investment level of some 38 or so percent. That has, of course, come down because of the slowdown. It's still around 34%. Now, you know, India's investment rates are not comparable to China, because China had investment rates of 50%, or if not higher. So that's nowhere on the cards for India. But most people would say that, you know, if you're investing somewhere between 34 and 36% of your GDP, it should be possible to achieve a growth rate of 8.5%, providing there's enough growth of productivity in the system. And India has a lot of catch-up to do on productivity. I mean, that's the main reason why developing countries grow faster than developed countries, because they're much poorer, have much lower levels of productivity, and they have a lot of catch-up to do. So we qualify on that account. The question is, will the policies that we have be conducive to ensuring this higher level of productivity? Well, you know, the short answer is that for the last 8 or 9 years, that has been happening. Actually, for the last 20 years, it has been happening. But in the earlier period, it was getting to reasonable growth rates. In the last 10 years, it's got to quite impressive growth rates. I see no reason to believe that that process has come to an end. I mean, if you look at the Indian economic situation, the domestic situation, it can, on many occasions, look quite messy. I mean, after all, you have to remember, this is an election year. We're going to have a general election in May. And in any democracy, an election year is not a year where anybody who's politically vocal spends their time only on looking on the positive. I mean, this is when everything is hotly debated, discussed, and in India, the temperature of the discussion is usually several degrees higher than in most other countries. But I think you need to filter that out. I think underneath it all, these are debates about who's going to be in power. They are not debates about reversing economic policy. So my fundamental assumption here and proposition is that I think there's a lot of commonality of understanding on the part of our politicians and our different political parties that they have to deliver performance. I don't think the Indian people will, whatever excuse is given, they will not be willing to accept a performance level which is significantly below what has historically been achieved. I think they'll understand that 9% growth was when the world was booming. And they'll certainly understand that if the world is not booming, then we probably can't do better than an average of 8 in the coming years. But anything less than that will simply not be acceptable. And I think I talk to politicians all the time, I think they know that. So the real issue is, will we be able to do what is necessary in order to bring about the kind of productivity increases which would help achieve this objective, while at the same time keeping macroeconomic balance in place. And I mean, I don't have the time to go into this too much longer, but the short answer is I think we do know what needs to be done, and the chances are that we can actually achieve this. So let me identify some critical challenges which define the nature of the policy challenge over the next 3 or 4 years, spilling over beyond the election. I mean, the first clearly is the continuing and continued effort to bring the fiscal deficit under control. I mean, if we want a private sector dominated kind of development to take place, then we cannot have all the available savings of the country being absorbed in a fiscal deficit. I think we have to bring that fiscal deficit down. That's the government's policy. And the question is, what is it that's going to achieve that? I think there are 2 very important things which are more or less underway. One of them is the modernization of the tax system. I mean, India has for a long time now been discussing how to move over to an integrated VAT, which would enable the central government on the one hand to have its form of taxation, state governments to have its form of taxation, but both of them together, both of them separately have a strong VAT element, and there are very few rates and much broader tax bases. This is something that requires a constitutional amendment to bring in what we call a goods and services tax. There's been a lot of political discussion with the major political parties. It's something that requires the central government and the state government to modify their tax powers under the Constitution. That's why a constitutional amendment is required. But you know, anyone looking at the way those discussions have gone would come to the conclusion that differences have now narrowed quite a bit. And while it is not likely in an election year that the government will be able to bring about a constitutional amendment just before the election, I think most people think that the new government, whether it's the present government which comes back in some form or some other government, would be able to build on the consensus that has been achieved so far. And there's a very good chance that in the year 2014, we would actually have in place a goods and services tax. Now, businessmen tell me that the efficiency contributing component of bringing in a goods and services tax in India would be huge. I mean, some people say it will add 1 percentage point to the growth rate. Now, these sorts of assumptions are all, I mean, you can't prove them rigorously. But if you ask a whole bunch of businessmen, what is it that India should concentrate on, I mean, unanimously they would say the goods and services tax. You know, in the discussion on economic reforms in India, one of the unfortunate things is there's too much focus on whatever issue happens to be of special interest to foreign investors looking at India. I mean, you have endless discussions on multi-brand retail, and all of which is good, and we are in favor of investments in multi-brand retail. But those are not the game changers. The goods and services tax is a game changer. And what I'm saying is that partly because of our politics, it has taken longer to deliver than it should have, no question about it. But equally, it's an indication of the functionality of that politics, that we are pretty close to a conclusion. So I would say that you need to write India's economic future on the assumption that the goods and services tax is pretty much a done deal a year from now. That's the first point. The second point is there's a lot of push now into the whole issue of rationalizing subsidies. We are trying to do quite a major rationalization based really on introducing what is called a unique ID number with biometric identification. This has the immense advantage that any one individual can only claim the subsidy once. I mean, you can't be getting the subsidy under 5 different names. And we've started doing that in a pretty effective way. And my expectation is that over the next 2 or 3 years, this will introduce a very substantial resource-saving component without actually denying the subsidy to any eligible person. I mean, all the experience we have at the moment, all the evidence we have suggests that there are huge leakages from this system. I mean, to just give you one example, I mean, one of the subsidies that we used to have was very low price kerosene being given to, LPG being given to people at a highly subsidized price. And when they introduced a pilot on a pilot basis, making this available to people connected with having a unique ID number, they found that the actual demand for the product shrank by almost 40%. I mean, suggesting that there were many people that were getting the product under multiple names because it was not possible to identify who's actually, uniquely identify who the beneficiary is. So these are isolated examples of the possibility of gain, but I think on the fiscal side, the fact that we are introducing this can make a big difference. Just to give you a sense, we now have about 420 million people have been given unique ID numbers. That makes it the largest, by a huge measure, it's the largest biometrically identified database in the whole world. And at the moment, there's constant complaint that everybody who's got enrolled hasn't yet got the number, because the numbers are now so huge. They're enrolling about 100 million people practically every month. So the fact is, if 1% of these people are getting the number delayed for some reason, there's 1 million dissatisfied people who are, most of whom seem to be sending me emails saying, why haven't I got my ID number? So, don't be, and I think the press is focusing primarily on that. But actually underneath it all, the extent to which this thing is spread as a platform is actually quite remarkable. And I believe it will actually lead to much greater efficiency in due course. Second big area of productivity enhancement is really reform in the financial sector. Now, we have a new governor of the RBI, a very distinguished academic who's a lot of global experience, Dr. Raghuram Rajan. And Raghu has outlined a very comprehensive agenda which would essentially bring in a lot more competition into the banking system, starting the process of granting new bank licenses, which would be both to foreign banks and to new Indian private sector banks, putting the whole issue of financial inclusion on a faster track, and more generally deepening the development of a financial sector to go beyond just banks, to look at other instruments, look at capital markets, and also begin the process of opening up the financial sector to global flows. So lots of innovative steps that are being taken in this area, which in my view would enable a lot more of investable resources to be brought into the country and directed to the areas where they would be most effective. So that's on the financial sector. A big area which we've been working on really for the last several years with some success and some problems also surfacing is infrastructure. There's no way that India can grow at 8% unless it can hugely expand the investment that it is doing in infrastructure, by which I mean things like ports and roads and airports and electric power generation and transmission and so on. And in all these areas, we have laid out very ambitious plans. And they're not plans that are driven by the assumption that there will be only public investment. There will be public investment, but a lot of it will be supported by public-private partnership, bringing in the private sector to invest in infrastructure. Actually, we've done a lot of that, and a lot of that has also been successful. Some of that has actually run into problems. So we're now reviewing the experience we've had with public-private partnership to see what is needed to streamline the system so that the kinds of problems that are surfacing are handled effectively. But definitely, development of infrastructure is one of the critical areas that government should be focusing on. Looking a little longer term, I mean, the big role of government in this process is, of course, in the area of health and education. I think India has been late in focusing on this aspect. I mean, traditionally, the Indian government has tended to focus a lot in the early days on investments, etc., all very good things. But I think they've tended to neglect, we've tended to neglect both health and education. And what is happening now is a sort of a conscious decision that government resources need to be directed to these areas, because this is what will make growth inclusive. I mean, we cannot have high levels of investment, expect to have high levels of growth, and expect the benefits of that growth to be spread more widely if we don't have a population that's also healthier and also better educated. So it's kind of to close those linkages, we need more education. I think Mr. Dhahan mentioned that your father was also concerned about exactly these areas, and I think he was He was absolutely right. We should have listened to him earlier, but at least he should feel that we're listening to him now. I tell you, the big issue here is that it's very easy, it's not very easy, but it's easy for governments to say, yes, we worry about education, yes, we'll make money available. But you know, the biggest challenge is how to make that money, put that money to use effectively. It's very easy to hire a lot of teachers and have no impact whatsoever on education levels on the ground. And right now what we are struggling with is how do you achieve that transition? Because it's not just a question of money, it's not just a question of hiring teachers, it's not just a question of putting up school buildings, it's a question of making sure that the accountability and commitment and so on of the teachers and the way children interact and the way parents sort of encourage them, all of it leads to better education. And you know, for a large number of our kids who are what you would call first-generation learners, I mean, they're children of people who didn't go to school, the methods used in most schools assume that parents at home are going to help their children. And if you've got a very large number of first-generation learners, that's just not the right assumption. So I think there are big issues there. I'm not really competent to pronounce on them, but all I want to say is that we're now facing those issues. But you know, all countries have faced those issues. And I mean, I frequently tell people at home that if you're really worried about whether kids are learning in school, you'll be worrying about it for 50 years, because in the United States, they're worrying about exactly the same thing. So there's no simple solution. But I think if we put enough money, enough energy, and enough sense of accountability, then in large parts of the country, the results will be positive, and there'll be parts of the country where it doesn't work, and then they'll learn from each other. I think this issue of how to make growth inclusive is absolutely crucial. Doubly so in a functioning democracy where everybody is empowered, everybody participates. I don't know how we must be the only people in the world trying to achieve 8% growth at very low per capita income levels and with 250 television channels all going 24/7. So it's not easy. It's not easy to manage that, and certainly any growth process that's not inclusive is simply not going to survive the test of social acceptability. And you know what is also interesting is that what is inclusive is now a more sophisticated, multidimensional concept. I mean, 10 years ago, inclusive meant there must be a reduction in poverty. And you know, all the data says that we have actually succeeded in bringing down poverty. But just about when we've done that, we've ourselves redefined the meaning of inclusiveness to say that's only one dimension of being inclusive. Inclusiveness today means that every group, I mean, you might say sub-ethnic group, different groups in the country, the most obvious and the ones that we're always concerned with are the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, the minorities. Each one of them should also sense that they're getting enough of the benefits of growth. Now, you know, it's quite possible to be reducing poverty, but to have groups that somehow feel that they're not benefiting as much as other groups are. This becomes a little more complicated if you put a regional dimension to it, because we are, after all, geographically, moderately, not as large geographically as Canada, but fairly large country with lots of differences. And therefore, no growth process can be called inclusive unless most of the states feel that they're also benefiting. That's another good news in the sense that in the last 5 or 6 years of the 11th plan period, one of the big differences from earlier periods is that the states that were growing very slowly are now growing much faster. There's a convergence of growth rates taking place. So we don't have a situation which we did have 10 years ago, where some of the country was growing much slower, and these were the poorer parts. I think that growth rate acceleration of these states has actually occurred. So the states look at their own performance. They're able to say that they're actually doing a lot better than they were doing earlier. But now you have the problem within states. People want to know, well, yeah, the state's doing well, but what about this area and what about this district? So actually, the issue of inclusiveness is more like, it's almost impossible to limit it by saying this is what it means. I think it basically means that in a democracy, the system must work so that everybody thinks it's fair. And some of it actually can't be measured. I mean, for example, to my mind, one of the most important things about inclusiveness is really intergenerational mobility. I mean, people are much more willing to accept that their own income levels cannot radically be improved once they've reached working age with a certain amount of skills. They're much more willing to accept that if they believe that their children have a future which could be much better than theirs. So what the system is delivering is not something that's very easily measured by looking at what the current situation is. It's really measured by what expectations does it create about, in people, about the kind of future their children can have. And I think that if one goes into this in detail, and this is true in every country, you find that sometimes some aspects of it do not shape up as well as you would like. But I would say on the whole in India, the social mobility, social churning that's taking place is much larger than many people think. There are new areas coming up which earlier were not developed and are now developed. It's certainly not a situation where the big growth, all the major growth is in the traditional centers. I mean, there are cities that were not important 10 years ago, which are today very important, and so on and so on. So I think that we have to make sure that even as India accelerates to whatever 8% or something like that, that acceleration is actually inclusive. Now, one last point, because I think I am running out of time, and since I'm here for the Indo-Canadian Energy Dialogue, it's only appropriate that I should mention that, you know, one of the biggest challenges that we will have in India in trying to achieve an 8% growth rate is the challenge of managing the energy requirements of high growth. And India is an energy deficient country. I mean, if you look at the major sources of energy, I mean, traditionally we thought we had huge amounts of coal and didn't really need to import very much. That's changed. I mean, today we're importing coal at the margin. We never had as much by way of oil, and we've been heavily import dependent on oil. So that's likely to continue. Much the same thing is true of gas. Now, the good news, of course, and this is where the Indo-Canadian Energy Dialogue helps to cast some positive light on it, there's lots of supply responses taking place in the rest of the world. There's a lot more oil, certainly in Canada, than people thought, much more gas in Canada than people thought. All of this is good news for us, and we encourage the fullest exploitation of these resources. And remind our Canadian hosts that as an energy deficient country, we're actually quite keen to see these resources developed, exported to India, developed by Canadians, others by Indians. So actually the management of the energy transition, for management of energy is going to be very crucial. Now, one very important part of the management of energy is actually pricing. I mean, we need to economize on energy, we want to be more energy efficient, and we want to be more energy self-sufficient. So this means we ought to be reducing as much as possible our demand for energy so that we become less energy intensive. We ought to also be increasing as much as possible the domestic supply of energy. So if you look at the price implications of both of these, from the consumer's point of view, by and large, consumer prices have to rise, and from the producer's point of view, the price paid to producers has to rise, and that is very difficult for any political system to explain, because the bottom line is, in the end, the consumer has to pay a higher price for energy. The current position all over the world is that we must economize on energy, we must find new sources of energy, but we mustn't raise any energy prices. It's how to grapple with that is actually not an economic issue. It's somehow managing to package good, sensible economics into whatever is politically feasible. And I think that in the last few years, we've had some reasonable success in doing that. have introduced more flexibility in energy pricing than was the case earlier. It's much less than it should be, but we are not stuck in a system that's unviable. We seem to have agreed that we need to move in this direction, and the difference of opinion is whether we're moving fast enough. So, none of these things ever get sorted out at one go. That's not how political systems work, and it's certainly not how democratic political systems work. But I think if you step back and ask yourself, is there enough in the system which suggests an ability to take sensible decisions, which suggests pressure on the government to perform, which suggests putting economic performance at the center of the stage? I think the short answer is that's really the way it's moving. And with all of that, I think, therefore, it's not unreasonable for us to say that we will get to something like an 8% growth path, but I think we've lost a couple of years in that process, because this is the second year of the 12th five-year plan. And we're certainly not going to be 8%. We probably won't even be 6% in the first 2 years. So one should say that the 8% target remains valid, but there's been a slippage in how quickly it can be achieved. Well, with those words, thank you for inviting me. And if there are any questions, more importantly, if there's time for questions, I'm very happy to take them.